Hello, everyone, and welcome back. You might wonder why I'm dancing and singing. And I'd like to say it's because I'm so excited about literary devices, which I am. But in addition to that, it's because I have just finished listening to this literary device rap that I have linked for you in your Brightspace. That full disclosure may not be your thing. It might be something that I am just nerding out a little bit over here about over here. But it is a fun song that ended up getting stuck in my head, and I was excited to find it. And hopefully you will enjoy it. I am in awe at the talent of the man who's done this. It's amazing. So you could go ahead and give that a listen. Maybe after we go over this as a little reward to yourself for having made it through another lecture video. Yay! So, literary devices, what are they? As Jed Bloom says, our literary device rapper extraordinaire, literary devices are like food. It's like food with spices, like spicing up your writing, adding flavor to your writing and making it more exciting. And they are tools that you can use to achieve certain tasks. And certain literary devices achieve things that other literary devices don't, and some achieve similar things, some kind of overlap, but they are little tools or fancy spices that you can add to your writing, to allow it to become more digestible and more agreeable, and to allow your readers to have more fun while they're reading what you're saying, and also to help show your readers your meanings and your purpose and the point of whatever it is that you are writing. So, who uses literary devices? The answer is pretty much everyone, from politicians to advertising companies to doctors to lawyers and anyone else that you can think of. Teachers, of course. You might not realize it, but you're often using literary devices to help express your meaning in different ways and reach a wider audience and get your reading to stick. And why are they important? Well, of course, because of all of the reasons that I have been saying. The fact that they give you and your writing a certain power to communicate that without them you might not have. Oftentimes, literary devices are taking the situation that you're trying to talk about and comparing it to a different situation that others might be familiar with as well. And it allows you to get to the emotional aspects of certain things. It allows you to describe complex and complicated thought, ideas, and patterns in ways that might be more accessible. And of course, they allow you to have fun. And I really love literary devices. And we'll be going through a couple of them today, not all of them by any means, because there are many, but a couple of the most popular ones today, where you can learn about what they are and how to use them. So the first literary device that I want to talk about is an allegory. An allegory is a piece of literature that uses symbols to construct hidden meanings that usually comment on politics or morality. Oftentimes, what is being said in an allegory can be critical, and just like I had mentioned in prior videos, it's more readers are more receptive to criticisms when they are not being so directly told, but when they're being shown using symbols. One of the most popular allegories is George Orwell's Animal Farm, in which animals are used to comment upon communism. The next literary device that we're going to talk about is alliteration. And alliteration is when you repeat the same sound in many words that are directly next to each other or at least close to each other. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Yes, got that one. That is a great and very obvious example of an alliteration. And you might want to think about why alliterations can be helpful. So when you are thinking about, say, a story where there is a mouse in a field and you're reading a statement that says, on a sizzling hot summer day, something crept sneakily near the mouse. We have a repetition of the sound, which may indicate that there is a snake near the mouse because there's a hissing sound that comes with a sizzling summer day. You could also use certain sounds to mimic the way the ocean sounds, or mimic the kind of repetition of an alarm, or to kind of draw out some type of abrasive emotion. But you can use alliteration to add an extra layer of depth to your work by engaging that auditory or the hearing of your readers. The next literary device that we're going to talk about is an allusion, and that starts with an A, not an I, not an illusion that a magician might do, but an allusion. And an allusion, ALLUSION, is a brief reference to a popular culture or popular figure or idea in some way or another. So for instance, for those of you who are Taylor Swift fans, there's a song where she says, "Romeo, take me somewhere we can be alone." And she is alluding to Romeo. And most people are familiar with Romeo and Juliet. And by Taylor Swift calling this person Romeo, she's letting her listeners know that this person is romantic and the love that they have is beautiful and maybe tragic. We can digest that however we want. But she clearly is using an allusion to call out to a specific audience that would know who Romeo was. So this is not an in-depth description. It's just kind of a fleeting, brief mention of something that people of a particular audience or many people might know. And it's a way to get people involved and get people to understand, oh, I know who this guy is, or this guy, what this guy is going to be about, because we're calling him a modern day Romeo. The next literary device is an analogy. An analogy is when you're conveying a new or complicated idea by using the blueprint of an old one or a less complicated idea. For example, you might say, in the same way one cannot have the rainbow without the rain, one cannot achieve success without hard work. And so we're talking about these ideas that are as old as time of the nature of the rain, which has sometimes a negative connotation to it, but having to endure that storm or that unpleasantness to then feel the beauty and the awe of the rainbow. And it's saying that feeling is similar to when you do hard work and you're putting in a lot of work and you are maybe experiencing things that are not as pleasant as you would want them to be, in order for you to feel that pleasant and wonderful experience as getting a reward for your hard work. This next literary device is one we talked about a little bit already, and that's diction. Diction is when you are deliberately choosing your words or phrases in order to create a mood or a vibe. One of the most powerful wielders of diction is Edgar Allan Poe. If any of you have ever read any of Edgar Allan Poe's works, if you were given another work of his without knowing it was him, you would likely be able to pick it out because Edgar Allan Poe uses specific words to give off a creepy and unsettling vibe. For example, if Edgar Allan Poe was talking about a person smiling, he would not say the person smiled at her, but instead the person grinned at her, or maybe the person smirked at her, because he's deliberately choosing a word that means something similar in its denotative definition or its dictionary definition, but has a different connotation. And a connotation is a kind of socially prescribed or emotional connection to the word. So even though smile, grin, and smirk all have different emotional vibes or connotations, they essentially mean, in their dictionary definition or their literal definition, curling your lips up into a half moon, or showing your teeth in an expression of emotion, right? They have a similar literal meaning, but the emotions behind it and the connections of those words give the word grin or smirk a creepier vibe that Edgar Allan Poe would use to deliberately try to create an atmosphere for his readers. The next literary device is a euphemism, and you may have heard this before. A euphemism is the use of mild language to talk about something that's not easy to talk about or is embarrassing or uncomfortable. You have probably used this when you tell people you have to go to the bathroom. You can use it when you're telling somebody has died. That's a heavy statement that is hard to be taken very literally. So maybe you say they've passed away. If you are going to be fired, which I really hope none of you ever are, but if that happens, I would hope that the person who is doing this horrible thing, or maybe necessary thing, we like to think that everybody has their reasons and consider all perspectives, but the person who is committing this act would say they have to let you go instead of the "you're fired," the more abrasive kind of way of relaying that information. So a euphemism is sort of the same thing as sugarcoating something, allowing you to deliver complex, embarrassing, or unsettling news in a way that is more palatable or easier to receive. The next literary device we'll talk about is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is to suggest an outcome to a story. So there's a great cartoon of a caveman looking at and kind of pointing to a stick with some rocks around him. And there's a shadow cast on the cave's wall of this caveman looking at a stick, but it looks like he's looking at a phone. He's looking at a cell phone, and it says foreshadow on it. And that is a great example of foreshadowing, because what's being foreshadowed is this advance in technology, that this caveman is looking at a stick and there are rocks around him. And that's implying that maybe he's going to discover fire, because when you use sticks and rocks in a certain way, you can create fire, which can then, of course, cast a shadow and then lead us all the way up into our technological age where we're using cell phones. So foreshadowing is when there is some sort of clue as what's to come. In the alliteration example, when we talked about the sizzling summer day and there being a creature creeping up on the mouse, we have that repetition of the S sound, and we talked about a snake possibly coming to get the mouse, and that is a form of foreshadowing. So you can use alliteration as a form of foreshadowing. You can use imagery as a form of foreshadowing. If you're having a great time and your character is having a great time, and all of a sudden there are like dark clouds in the distance and a boom of thunder, you might be foreshadowing that an event is going to happen, and likely one that's not good, depending on how you feel about thunderstorms. But you can use foreshadowing in a number of ways to give your audiences clues about where the story is going. Hyperbole is the next literary device that we're going to be talking about, and it's an extravagant exaggeration. You can be thinking that this is the best flex course you've ever taken, and that would be a bit of a hyperbole because you haven't taken them all, I am guessing, and you're making a bit of an exaggeration. You can alternatively say this is the worst flex course you've ever taken, which would be an equally accurate exaggeration because you haven't taken all of the courses. So it is when you're talking about something as the single most delicious food in the world or the absolute worst experience you ever had, you overemphasize and exaggerate in order to draw attention to how good or bad or enjoyable or unenjoyable certain things are. And of course, you can use this for other emotions as well, how worried you were or how excited you were. So it draws attention to the intensity of the emotion, even if the logic around what you're saying doesn't make full sense. The next literary device we're going to be talking about is imagery. We also talked about this a bit, but imagery is using words and phrases to create these mental images by focusing on the reader's senses. So it's very similar to using those sensory engaging descriptions that we already talked about. Think about trying to paint a visual picture for your readers. That is when you are well, think about trying to not only paint a visual picture for your readers, but also a one where they can hear and they can smell and they can taste and they can touch. And that's how writers use imagery. Now, the next literary device can be a little bit complicated, and that's irony. Some people have a hard time defining irony, and that's because it can mean many things and it can come in many ways. But irony essentially is a phrase or situation that seems deliberately contradictory to what one might expect. And it often ends up that it's amusing as a result. So if you see a stone, for example, with some words chiseled into it, and the words read, "Nothing is written in stone," we've got some amusing irony going on there. And that's because they're saying nothing is written in stone, yet it is ironically written in stone. Another fun way to think about irony is the Alanis Morissette song, "Isn't It Ironic?" If you have heard this before, none of what Alanis Morissette says is ironic. Rain on your wedding day, that's nature. That's not irony. And so that's something that is a little confusing. And I used to think, oh, wow, none of these things are ironic until like last year, I realized the whole song is so ironic because you would expect a song with the chorus, "Isn't it ironic?" to contain many ironic situations. But because none of the situations that are being presented there are ironic, the entirety of the song ends up being ironic. And I know it's a little bit confusing, but think about it. Irony happens when you're expecting something to happen or you're expecting a certain situation, and usually it's the opposite and it's in a funny way. If you're expecting the song to have all of these examples of ironic situations, but it has the exact opposite by having none of them, it is kind of amusing and it makes that song so genius when you take that extra step to realize, wow, this is how the song's ironic by not being ironic. So the next literary device that we're going to talk about is juxtaposition. And juxtaposition is the imaginative placing of a person, concept, place, idea, or theme parallel to another one in a way that connects them and some meaning comes out of the comparison. It can also be physical. You can physically juxtapose things, but when you're physically on the page and writing, you can do it physically out in the world. It happens a lot in advertising, but in writing, it's often imagined, where you're imagining the juxtaposition of certain things. I always think of this example of the juxtaposition of two billboards that I saw a long time ago. And the first billboard on the top said, "Child obesity, don't take it lightly." And there's a woman who looks very stern saying, "Child obesity, don't take it lightly," talks about food stamps right on the billboard. And despite the fact that it is punny, because don't take it lightly, it's maybe a little bit problematically punny. Right below that billboard, juxtaposed to that billboard, is a woman holding a McDonald's bag and saying, my kind of shopping spree, the dollar menu. And it's got pictures of hamburgers, French fries, and all of the goodies from McDonald's. So juxtaposed to a serious billboard about childhood obesity that is also advertising food stamps, we have a McDonald's billboard that is advertising its dollar menu. So trying to be affordable. Yet McDonald's is likely something that contributes to the problem of childhood obesity. Now, I don't know who put the billboard there first, but the juxtaposition of the childhood obesity ad about trying to stop childhood obesity and then the McDonald's ad is creating a certain type of meaning that makes you wonder what we're actually doing, and maybe in America, maybe elsewhere as well, but what's actually happening here, and what is this kind of situation? Why is childhood obesity happening? And so the juxtaposition of those two allows you to think about their connection and their meaning and how they can be problematic when they're put together and right next to each other, and kind of allows you to believe or think about certain elements of society. Next, we have one of my favorites, which is the paradox. And it only became my favorite after kind of wrapping my head around it for a long time, because I often call these the brain breakers. And a paradox is the use of concepts or ideas that are contradictory, but when they're put together or they kind of have a connection, they have significant value. It's a kind of cycle that you can't always get out of. One of my favorite paradoxes is a picture of Pinocchio saying in his dialogue box, "My nose will grow now." So we all know that Pinocchio's nose grows when he's lying. So if he's saying, "My nose will grow now," and his nose is not growing, he's lying, and therefore his nose starts to grow. However, he's still saying, "My nose will grow now," and once his nose starts growing, he is no longer lying, so it will stop. But then once it stops and he's saying, "My nose will grow now," he's lying, and it starts to grow again. And there is this frustrating cycle of the nose growing and not growing, growing and not growing, because this is a paradox. It's a cycle that kind of contradicts each other, but it almost makes sense. Charles Dickens writes, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Though that's also a paradox. How can something be the best of times and the worst of times, right? Those are two contradicting ideas. However, when they place together, you can make sense from that. Take a minute to think about what Charles Dickens was trying to achieve with that paradox. Maybe he was talking about how it was the best of times for some people and it was the worst of times for others. Or maybe he was just saying that he was very apathetic and he didn't really feel anything. The narrator didn't really feel anything when they were saying it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, because the moment that he was feeling, or they were feeling, was the best and the worst, because he didn't really have a spectrum either way. One of the most common literary devices is the metaphor and the simile. Metaphor is a comparison without using like or as, and a simile is a comparison that uses like or as. What you might not be familiar with, however, is a conceit, which is a kind of extended metaphor that compares two very unlike things in a clever way. So I believe it was Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 that you may be familiar with. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" And so you're thinking, okay, how is Shakespeare comparing this person to a summer's day? How is a summer's day the same as this person? They are both very different things, but throughout the entire sonnet, Shakespeare is comparing them. And that is a conceit or a kind of extended metaphor. Next, we have personification, which we touched upon a little bit. And the personification is the practice of applying human traits or characteristics to non-human elements. So in Romeo and Juliet, we have Shakespeare saying, "The gray-eyed morn smiles on the frowning night." Usually mornings don't have eyes. I don't know about you guys, but I've never seen a morning have eyes. And now nights don't usually have mouths. So we're adding eyes and mouths to the times of day. And it's allowing us to consider that the night might be sad that it's over and the sun is happy that it gets to kind of start its day. Next, we have one of my favorites, the pun. And that is also known as a dad joke, but it is a play on words or a time when you use words to suggest two or more possible meanings. So if you are cooking in the kitchen and you grab a cheese grater and you say to the person you're cooking with, "I know it's cheesy, but I feel great," you are using a pun. Now, I know it's cheesy both meaning kind of silly in a overused or kind of tired way, and the fact that it's a grater that shreds cheese. But I feel great again with the grater, but also feeling good and happy. You are being silly and you're putting some entertaining value on your cooking experience by applying two meanings using the same phrase, or having a phrase that can mean two different things, usually in a humorous way. We're almost to the end, so bear with me, but we are going to talk a little bit about satire and oxymorons. So satire, like irony, is a little bit hard to put your finger on. It's something that is a little bit difficult to define, but it's usually the practice of making fun of some sort of human weakness or characteristic, or a societal weakness or characteristic, and usually includes some sort of socio-political commentary, and its purpose is usually to derive some sort of reaction from the reader or the viewer in order to get them to think about these socio-political issues or these human flaws critically. Some of the most common satirical TV shows include South Park, Saturday Night Live, Family Guy. Some, if you guys are familiar at all with The Onion, that's a satirical kind of website with satirical articles, but it's usually humorous, it's usually entertaining, it's usually borderline problematic. And oftentimes people say that satires can get away with things that a lot of other people can't. And maybe that's something to consider. Why can satire kind of push on these problematic buttons when, say, political figures, if they do that, are not treated with the same kind of praise even, or rejection. And lastly, we have the oxymoron. We'll end on an easy one here. And an oxymoron is, again, this kind of contradictory, contrasting concepts that are put together in a way that actually end up making sense. So if something was icy hot, or of course, one of the more popular ones, the jumbo shrimp, right? So if you are taking two contradictory concepts and putting them together in a way that makes sense, you're using an oxymoron. So we only went through a few of the literary devices that are out there. Go ahead and give the literary device wrap a listen. Jeb Bloom, it was very exciting, and it probably will stick in your head a little bit more than this lesson, but hopefully this lesson also stays with you.